Great. Okay, so everyone can see the slide there? Yeah, cool.
Yep.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Neringa, and welcome everyone. So of course, a special thank you to you and Camille for organizing. So yes, my name's Adele. I'm really excited to be here tonight. We do only have 30 minutes, but I am aiming to wrap it up in 20 to 25 so we can have some Q&A at the end. So please just write down your questions as you think of them and hopefully we get to them. But if not, you can reach me on Twitter. There's my handle there. I am _Carpenter. There we go. So before we get started, and just so you can get the most out of the talk, I just want to let you know there's not really a lot of information on these slides today. There will be a larger focus on storytelling. So you might just want to set your options to side-by-side mode, and then you can see sort of the slides and me talking as well, and maybe even the other attendees if you select that view. Of course, not mandatory, but it might help your experience today. So I am a software engineer at Trifork Amsterdam. Trifork is a project-based JVM-focused software development company, and we hire out self-sufficient teams to complete projects for our customers. It really is a tech company for techies. You'll find our CEO from time to time rolling up his sleeves and debugging for a customer. We're also the company behind the GoTo conferences, which you may also have heard of. Anyway, my career at Trifork actually started 2 years before I started programming. So in a sense, I was a programmer before I could write a line of code. It sounds a little odd, but let me explain. In that 2 years at Trifork, I had a few roles, mostly in sales and marketing for the GoTo conferences. That meant I had a front row seat at some high quality tech events. I met many talented people, attendees, sponsors, and speakers alike. Being in sales, it was my job to understand the product and the intended audience. What made them tick? Why would they come to a conference? It didn't take long during this research phase for my full nerd to come out. Even though I had no idea what was being said half the time, gradually as I went to more and more events and met more and more people, I did start to develop an understanding of the tech landscape. I became adept at throwing out one-liners at the right moment to stimulate a discussion. See, that's a nice choice for embedded systems. You know COBOL, but you're so young. But monoliths can be sexy. JavaScript, ew. After a year on the sidelines, I decided I wanted in on the action. And naturally, I decided to celebrate this moment of enlightenment by getting myself a backpack that any developer would be proud of. When I thought about becoming a programmer, I knew that I would need to pick a language. I knew it didn't really matter which one I started with. The main thing I needed to learn was the manner in which computers must be spoken to. In other words, logic. So I dove into a book about learning to program as a beginner in Kotlin. You can actually see it on the desk there. I went through data structures, control flow, types, classes, objects, functions, and important Kotlin concepts of immutability and nullability. I came back to work after 2 weeks with the spring in my step. I had a sense of what it all meant, rather than being lost in the dark. That excitement was short-lived. I asked one of my colleagues what I needed to do to keep learning and getting better. Build something, he said. Oh. Eventually, being a fan of RuPaul's Drag Race, I decided on a simple web app that generates random drag queen names. It would be built in Spring Boot and Kotlin. Only 2 technologies. How complex could it be, right? Let's quickly go through all the technologies that I used in that first app. So it was a Spring Boot app written in Kotlin. Okay, not so scary. But of course, Spring Boot includes this lot. But that's not everything because I don't want to use an embedded database. but I also don't want to install MySQL. And I'm going to need a front end, and I need to build it somehow. At that time, Kotlin DSL hadn't really taken off, so I just went for the standard. And of course, I wasn't writing this thing in a text editor, so let's not forget IntelliJ. But of course, that's not even it, because I need a vocabulary to describe what I'm doing, not only so I can verbalize any issues to another person, but as my inner monologue as I work. And of course, while my vocabulary was growing, these became my favorites, especially in those early days. And some of my colleagues with 10 plus years experience will still use these from time to time. So that I could take my colleagues' advice to build something seriously, when I returned to work after my 2-week Kotlin immersion, I negotiated with my employer to have 2 dev days a week. The setup was that I would spend 2 days in the office learning to code and spend the other 3 days in marketing earning my keep. This arrangement lasted about 6 months, and in that time, I managed to build 2 web apps using Spring Boot and Kotlin, the drag name generator, and a lunch rating app for the office. With the help of my colleagues, I even got the lunch app running in production and had set up a continuous delivery pipeline in GitLab, so I could push to master, and bam, my changes are there on a real-life server. As someone who thought the command line was magic only 7 months earlier, this felt like the coolest thing I had ever done. I wanted more. Meanwhile, I had noticed an interesting thing happening over those 6 months. Many of my colleagues who had known me as the marketing girl or the conference manager the conference organizer, had actually enjoyed supporting my programming quest by teaching me what they knew. They seemed invested in my progress, kept asking when I would be put on a project. They actually wanted to work with me. So the next step was clear. I needed to be put on a real life customer project. When I approached my CEO, who, by the way, is almost the complete opposite of this guy on the slide here, he had his doubts about that I could progress beyond a few toy projects, which honestly, could you blame him? Here I am, someone who didn't know what open source was when she interviewed 2.5 years ago, and only 7 months ago opened Terminal for the first time. And now she wants to write code that our customers pay good money for? Amazingly, he responded to my request by saying, "We can only try." We can only try. I felt like the luckiest person in the world. I had already been chatting with one of the teams, so I officially asked them if I could join. The answer was yes. So I'd done it. I'd found myself a team and a project. And to make the deal even sweeter, it was server-side Kotlin. Happy days. But of course, I really had no idea what lay ahead. A project where one of the 5 services we were responsible for was written in Kotlin, where parts of the code base were written in 2012 and still use Spring 4, where our team has 4 customers, each with a different implementation of the core service. It is large and overwhelming and awesome. I'm now a year into this project and just starting to get my head around all the moving parts. If I had my time again, I would do many things differently. But you don't know what you don't know. Here's my experience of some things that I've learned along the way. The first lesson actually came the second I said out loud, I want to learn how to program. It was at this moment that I realized that if I was going to have any hope of success, I would need to leave my ego at the door, accept the affordances that being a complete novice provides, embrace uncertainty, be comfortable not knowing things. And then later, I realized that this mindset must be there to stay. There is always going to be more to learn. I am comfortable not knowing stuff, and I'm continuously building awareness of stuff I might need to know later. As a noob, this is the only way to stay sane and is a core skill of the programming profession. So when I was confronted with the growing list of technologies during my first attempt to build something, I had to realize that was literally no way that I could build anything, no matter how small, if I didn't abstract the internals of these things away. It's now 18 months on, and Spring Boot is still a lot of magic to me, and that's okay. I'm at peace knowing there are a lot of things that I don't know yet, but I can always learn the details when I need them. In the now famous words of Donald Rumsfeld, known unknowns are better than unknown unknowns. So who here has been in a meeting where someone could be you, has said, now wait, let's just take a step back for a minute. Seeing a couple of nods. It's fairly common, and I've heard it more times than I care to remember, both in and out of programming land. And the person that says it either comes across as a know-it-all or as a genius, but never as an idiot. That's because we all understand, at least on an intellectual level, how important and necessary good abstractions are. It's just that we can be notoriously bad at it in practice. Like a beagle on the trail, it is easy to get caught up in the rabbity scent of working out the technical details while ignoring the call of dinner time. I have learned that making progress as an engineer means developing a keen sense of what's worth investment right now and what isn't. It's about making a choice about what not to do, what details to ignore, and trusting your judgment in that. Abstraction is one of the tools that we use to form that judgment. And just like any tool, the more you use it, the better you get at using it. The next lesson I learned was probably the biggest, in that I've applied it to almost every area of my life. I'm a product of the way that many children, girls in particular, are raised. Be good, go to school, get good grades, don't make too many mistakes, you will be rewarded. I held on to this mantra for way too long, but it was for the better part shattered once I started working as a developer. I remember those first few days being frozen in analysis paralysis, wondering what on earth I'm supposed to be doing, wondering if I was doing the right thing and holding my breath every time I made a change, praying I hadn't broken what I'd already done. Sure, it sounds dramatic, but inside your own head can be a very tense place. I was in the middle of one of these fear loops when one of my colleagues approached me. Let's call him Malcolm. How are you going? Malcolm asked. I'm pretty sure he knew already from the deep frown I was sporting. Oh, it's hopeless, I said. I've achieved nothing today. It just won't work. And he said, very matter-of-factly, and without a hint of sarcasm, oh, so you're learning a lot then? My frown changed to be one of confusion rather than frustration, with one eyebrow slightly raised. Huh? I thought to myself. Malcolm smiled. It always sticks better when you have gone through a lot of pain to figure it out. I still have those days. You're becoming a real programmer now. I realized in that moment that I'd been lying to myself. I claim that learning is something that I value, but here I am frustrated because I'm not producing anything. And I had made the dangerous connection that experiencing failure, no matter how small, meant that I was a failure. For me, the realization that failure is learning runs a lot deeper than learning from your mistakes and iterating until you get it right. For me, it's liberation from perfectionism. So I'd learned that iteration and Googling could get me a long way in programming. But of course, this is not the whole story. As I moved from working on narrowly defined tickets to more complicated ones, my focus shifted from general programming concepts to project specifics. Why is the project built this way and not that? Which machine do I need to log into to view particular data? Which service is responsible for this API? What other endpoints are available? Can I make modifications? I do not have the right data to reproduce locally. How do I go about reproducing this issue in dev or acceptance? It was when I started asking these questions, which inconveniently coincided with the first work from home orders, I realized the importance of good documentation. I've been working predominantly on two user-facing services, which are essentially a layer on top of one, like a larger core service. As part of my investigation for a ticket, I needed to trigger an event from the core service locally and see how it was handled in one of the user-facing services. I had set up the local environment for the core service when I first joined the team, but it had been months since I ran it. I opened the project and tried to run it. No dice. Double checked the docs, made sure I hadn't missed anything. Everything is set up as it should be. So I asked one of my colleagues for a Zoom. We spent the next couple of hours troubleshooting. We made decent progress, but sure enough, as one thing's resolved, another issue pops up. And where I keep drawing a blank, my colleague keeps coming up with ideas of things to try. In the end, after running a few scripts, making some edits to the configuration, and clean building half a dozen times, we got it up and running. I thank her and recap the things that we tried so that I have a reference for next time. She suggests that I add the list to the docs, and it would be useful to her future self as well. The request really struck me. In some way, I didn't feel experienced enough to update the docs. I was happy to sit around and complain about them because someone, somewhere in the past, should have definitely predicted the precise information I would need today. The insight from my colleague that we write docs for our future selves was key. It took away the feeling that I had nothing useful to contribute because I was new and less experienced. I can barely remember my own age. This is true. I calculate it from my date of birth, let alone the exact steps I took to troubleshoot something 3 months ago. Since then, I've also learned that by being actively engaged with the docs, you learn to trust it more. I've been burned a couple of times by documentation that was just completely out of date, where I wasted hours trying to figure out what was wrong before realizing the truth. At the risk of contradicting myself, no docs would have been better than wrong docs. Documentation is somewhat of a dirty word in the agile world as it conjures up images of thick binders sitting on dusty shelves. But it's not what I see at all. Good documentation doesn't need to be long. It can be quite simple. If there are quirks in the project, write it in the README. Brain dump in a troubleshooting section. If you see a Java doc that is out of date or just plain wrong, fix it. It doesn't need to be a perfectly edited journalistic masterpiece. It just needs to be there, and it needs to be up to date. Your future self and noobs like me will thank you. So as I mentioned, I have been a little unfortunate in my timing to become a programmer. I was working with my team for only 6 months when we received the first stay-at-home orders. I'm thankful it wasn't any earlier, but it was still a tricky transition, just as I was starting to find my feet. I was completing my work in a lot more isolation than I would have liked. And as we all know, we can always Zoom or Slack, but it's never quite the same, and you miss a lot of incidental learning and conversations. So in this environment, structured collaboration has become somewhat of a learning lifeline for me. My team has a 4 eyes policy, which often takes the form of a code review. And over the last 6 months, I have come to rely on the reviews in a much larger way than I expected I would. They are basically all of my, hey, can you come and have a look at this moments from a week or so, compressed into one merge request. And by highlighting this, I don't mean to extend the war and peace that is literature already written about what makes a good code review or how important collaboration is. All I want to do is leave you with a gentle reminder about how valuable they are for noobs, particularly in the times that we live in. In preparation for this event, I actually watched a talk from a couple of programming veterans, and they made a really nice point about how it's not actually a code review, it's a design review. So with that in mind, here are the kinds of things that are helpful in a review and those that are less so. So one of the first things I noticed is the delivery of the code review. This stood out to me because I'd experienced this before when I was working as a marketing content editor and coach. I learned then that unless you are a really cohesive team that has been working together for a long time, simply starting a comment thread is inefficient at best. A content or design review can really only work as a conversation, even better if it's in front of a whiteboard, virtual or otherwise. Even better if it's actually conducted before a line of code is written. Let's call it a code preview. By that, I just mean a discussion on how to solve the problem in the context of your project. This is something that I've gotten better at initiating and have found it to be really beneficial. A lot of you probably do it without thinking. For me, it's basically a conversation along the lines of, I have these requirements, I see these ways to solve it, but I'm not sure which fits the project the best. What would be your approach? I have found that this guidance earlier on makes both completion and review more efficient and enjoyable. I have found this equally true in programming and in content creation. And lastly, when it comes to giving feedback, I found that it lands best when it's used as a moment to share your expertise rather than initiate a heated discussion about tabs versus spaces. Not that anyone here would do that, I'm sure. For example, some of the most useful comments I've received are along the lines of, extract this as a method, use the shortcut command option M. There is a function or class already in the project that does basically the same thing. Is it possible to use it? We have a library on the class path that has lots of nice functions that handle this situation. You can replace this for loop with a for each flat map, and this is really important. Here's how. So to sum up, no matter how deep we get into our programming journey, there will always be more to learn. To keep our sanity and focus as we go, make wise use of abstractions. When things don't work out the way that we want, take comfort knowing that failure is learning. And in the day-to-day, remember that well-written documentation is important and collaboration matters. Your colleagues and future self will thank you. But for now, the thanks comes from me. I really appreciate you dropping in today, and I do look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yay! Virtual claps for you. So John, I see you unmuted. Perhaps you want to ask something.
Oh, sorry. No, I was only unmuting so she could hear my applause, but I realized I clapped out of sync with everyone. So yeah, I'll clap now. That's my applause.
Okay. Thank you, Adele. It was actually very interesting session, and I think not just in programming, these things happen like, oh, I need to learn this and this and this, and just it happens everywhere. So, but since we are here from programming and technical side, so Camilla and we are not technical at all. So what would be your advice if you would want to start programming? So
all right,
which programming language should we go to?
All right. So this is going to sound really unhelpful, but just start is actually the best advice I can give you. As I said, it doesn't really matter what language you choose, but you just pick something and start. For me, it was very clear because I worked at Trifork, which is a Java shop, and I actually had helped out with Kotlin conferences in addition to go-to conferences. And that book that I showed you on my desk, I actually won that book. So it was a bit serendipitous that I ended up doing Kotlin. And it was exactly what I needed. It was, I liked the book because the internet's a very big place, but it's also a very overwhelming place. But the book had a very clear structure of building up your knowledge step by step. So I would say probably just find the right resource that you can follow and just accept that your first language doesn't really matter that much. I might steer away from something like COBOL or Fortran. They're very old languages, by the way, but you don't need to start with anything. You don't need to worry too much about what you start with. Just get started.
Mm-hmm. Or first trying to find which company you want to work at, then looking what technology stack they are using, and then going to learn that.
If your goal is employment, yeah, that would be a savvy way to do it. And that's the way that I did it, because I really liked where I worked and I just sort of wanted to align myself with that.
Okay. What others think about programming languages? Perhaps we have someone who is for PHP, I don't know, .NET.
I have a lot of experience with PHP.
Okay.
I highly recommend that nobody ever uses it.
That's.
So I apologize if there is anyone in this room that has a career, the same career that I did spend a long portion of my earlier career on. I thoroughly recommend that PHP is not your first choice in programming language.
So what you're programming now?
I don't really code that much anymore, but I have a lot. I mean, I'm all over the place programming language wise because I'm a coach, so I support teams with whatever they're doing. So I have been supporting a team today, funnily enough, with COBOL.
Oh, COBOL.
Which is why I look drained of energy and enjoyment and joy. But no, I normally I do a lot of stuff with JavaScript and Java mainly, but a lot of JavaScript. Yeah, which for some reason, if I work with JavaScript, I don't look drained of energy and joy, but lots of people do when they work with JavaScript. Looking at Adele's face there.
I avoid it if I can. Dynamic typing freaks me out. I need to get comfortable with that before I move on.
Yeah, it's like it's a life choice.
There are two types of people: dynamic and strictly typed. Yeah, right.
And yeah.
Okay, so John, perhaps you want to ask something? Well, you are colleagues, huh?
No, we just know each other.
Okay.
we both no. I think that so for me the really interesting thing around what I really enjoyed about the talk is the same thing that is it Niringa?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Niringa said around how it actually applies well outside of the technical space, because I work with lots of people who are both I might be teaching them some technical topic, but actually a lot of the time I'm working with teams that are learning how to apply an agile method or how to learn about product development, and I can see it's the same learning cycle and the same fear there. And I'm just wondering whether or not obviously in all of the roles that you've had, and I remember talking to you about that photograph of you stood beside a ginormous some mining equipment that you when you were working in Australia, and that was essentially an engineering role, and then you were in sales and marketing in kind of for software companies, but you've done lots of different roles. How is the learning cycle different? Like you're obviously going to learn new stuff when you do different things, and is it actually a fairly similar process for you?
It's hard to compare them because learning to program has probably been when I've been the most engaged. This was something that I actively chose to learn, and I was kind of aware of the task up front, and so I basically just went all in. With sales and marketing, I kind of fell into that because I needed employment and I was somehow able to sell my way into the job. And then it was a bit like, oh, I've got money coming in now, but how do I make sure I'm not a fraud? It wasn't really my heart wasn't in it, but I was, I'm a survivor, I'm scrappy. So for me, it was different because of that level of engagement. So I was a lot more methodical learning to program, and a lot more reflective on the process because I just enjoyed every second.